How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. Peter Jackson's The Return of the King is now 20 years old, so I decided to bring these old Mumakil models back to life with a diorama that would make my 10-year-old self cry. Tears of joy, that is. Shortly after watching the movies, I got into the game's workshop tabletop game. My skills and access to materials were pretty limited, so there's a lot of work to clean up. The yellow Mumuk was given to me by my friend Than, who I used to play the game with when we were younger. His Mumuk was in a similar state of disrepair to mine, so today's video will basically just be an antique restoration video. These Oliphants have been sitting in storage for a decade and some change, so understandably they were missing some parts. Luckily, nothing missing was too difficult to recreate. I used balsa wood for the missing howdah supports, which I shaped, filed, and textured to make them look like the originals. I drilled some holes and used some pins to give everything a little bit more structural support. For most of the rest of the missing parts, I could use green stuff. Than's Mumuk was missing its ears, so I embedded some armature cartilage at the top of the ears and I draped and formed the green stuff into the rest of the ears. I did some further sculpting and cleaning up off camera. I made new tails out of green stuff for both of the models, and because I didn't want them to have the exact same pose, I decided to rip the head off of mine and reposition it, which was harder than I had anticipated. Finally, after applying some strategic torque using a metal tool, the head popped off and it was time to trim the neck. I marked out where I needed to cut, and I started the job with my hobby saw, and I finished the job with my bandsaw. With that neck piece gone, it was time to reposition the head. After drilling 2 holes in the back of the head with corresponding holes in the neck, I glued the head in place. There was now a huge gap in the neck, so I filled in most of the empty space with some aluminum foil, and then I gave the Mumuk a nice green bandana around its neck, which I added texture to blend it into the rest of the head nicely. I then removed the remaining bits of polyurethane glue, and I assembled the rest of the broken pieces. I wanted to maintain the vision that our younger selves had for these animals, so I reattached this chain that was supposed to be on Than's Mumuk, stretched from tusk to tusk. I always thought that feature was absolutely sinister in the movies. I made some green stuff flags and a large decorative cloth face covering for Than's Mumuk before adding some spikes to his chain. In its prime, my Mumuk also had spikes on its tusks, but not the ones connected with a chain. I carved up more toothpick spikes, I wrapped them in a little cord, and my younger self would be proud. With both of the big models refurbished, it was time to get out the small ones. I dug around for a bit and had to do a little bit of work to salvage these old Rohirrim, and Than generously gave me a bunch of his old Haradrim, which I combined with my own to make a nice little army. The next day, after the green stuff had dried, I primed all of the minis, including the Mumakil. Then it was time to paint. I started with the airbrush and gave the howdah a dark coat of brown sprayed mostly upward, trying to create some shadows. I followed that up with a lighter color for the wicker floors and top-down shade for the fabric. I then painted over all of the brown with a dark, deep red and shaded the elephant's skin with a dark purple blue. I then applied a highlight from above, followed by a dark glossy black wash to capture all the little wrinkles on the skin. After a few more shades of skin color, I painted on the details with a brush, including the eyes, and the Mordor Harad collaboration artwork on the trunk. And if you're thinking that the howdah looks too flat and dusty right now, that's where this oil wash comes in. This stuff seeps into all of the crevices with some nice deep color, and leaves a nice tint as well. When it dries, it looks even better. While the elephants are drying, let's paint the Haradrim. While I paint these miniatures, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. I used the same 5 colors for every one of these soldiers, just applied in different combinations. Given their lack of a standard uniform, this is an easy way to make them all look like they're members of the same army. Along with the men of Harad, who will be in the safety of their elephant backpacks, I also wanted a few lingering orcs on the ground. I lightly dusted everyone with a coat of sandy dust from the airbrush, including the Mumakil, whose howdahs were now dry. Off camera, I painted the 2 conductors who will be steering the elephants. Unfortunately, I didn't have a bald one. With all of the evil units painted, it was time to move on to the riders of Rohan. As I painted these, I couldn't help but think back upon sitting in the theater and watching as the full company of the Rohirrim rode into what they all knew might very well be their death at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. The music starts fittingly with the same melody that you hear during the last march of the Ents, and then it switches to the equally somber but triumphant theme of Edoras for the last time. Theoden's speech, the score, the scale of the battle, the pure courage and heroic sacrifice. There are few movie moments ever that I have seen that have impacted me that same way. I was 10 years old when that movie came out, and I watched it in theaters 20 years ago, and I still remember that moment in particular like it was yesterday. I've seen the movie plenty of times since then, and there are parts of the movie that get pretty long, but that one never gets old. After the minis were painted, it was time to partially clean my hobby mat and make the base. I used a gesso board as the foundation and a layer of XPS foam to build up the terrain. I glued the foam to the base using some foam-safe superglue man, and I used my butane torch. To add some subtle variation to the surface of the foam. Be sure to have good airflow and ventilation if you melt foam. The reason the air in Mordor is so bad is because they burn this stuff non-stop just for entertainment. Mordor doesn't have much in the way of entertainment. Luckily for me, the Pelennor Fields are pretty flat and almost have no elevation change. So after the torching, I mixed up some plaster, paint, and Mod Podge, which I spread evenly across the whole surface using my gloved hand. I then threw on some sand and flocking and pebbles to give the fields some texture. While the Fields of Pelennor are a great place for a massive battle, without texture, it would be pretty boring to look at. Once the watered-down glue and isopropyl alcohol that held the texture in place had dried, it was time to add some static grass. The field itself is not fully grassy, but rather has patches of grass, so I spread the static tack around accordingly. After splotching that with a brush, I applied the grass in one fell swoop, and I vacuumed up all the excess, collecting it in an old sock and saving it for later. I then dotted on a few more spots of that woodland scenic static tack, and I stuck longer grass clumps to just those areas. I then finally added some pre-made grass tufts to the base, and it was ready for priming. I started with a base coat of a dark brown, and I followed that up with a lighter tan that I sprayed on in a thinner layer. I then broke out my airbrush and began layering up the earthy colors of the field. While I paint this field, I'd like to bring your attention to one of my sisters who recently started her own art channel. If you like Lord of the Rings and Art Nouveau, you should go subscribe. She also has an Etsy shop where she sells her amazing artwork. Links will be below if you're interested. I used the lightest dirt color that I used on the base to dust up the feet of the Mumakil and all of the horses. I sprayed on the final color of yellow grass, and then I painted the sides of the diorama with black 4.0, and that was the painting done. After the black 4.0 was dry, I removed my old hobby mat, and it was time to begin assembly. To add extra support, I put metal rods in the feet of the Oliphants, and then I used super glue to hold it in place. Once the Mumakil were in place, the last detail to add to the howdah was some ropes. I used some dark brown string, I tied it up, and I ran it around like rigging on a ship, and I used some photos of the Mumakil from the movie as my reference. After the ropes were all in place, it was time to put all of the minis in place, starting with the drivers. I snapped the rest of the minis off of their bases, and I glued them into position as well. I know that some of you may be appalled that I won't be able to use these minis for a game now because they're glued in place, but even as a kid, playing the game was always secondary to the enjoyment of painting and terrain building. This diorama is something my 10-year-old self would have loved, whether playable or not. And if I ever decide to get back into it, I'll enjoy painting some new minis. The last thing to add to this diorama were some fallen soldiers. I cut up the base of one of the mumuks, and I thought it would be a great idea to make some molds, so that I could absolutely fill up the base with dead guys. I used a 2-part silicone putty mold, and after mixing it thoroughly, I pressed it over the dead plastic bits. After about 30 minutes, I peeled the plastic out of the molds, and I tested the molds with some plaster that I mixed very thinly to get into all of the cracks and hard-to-reach areas. In the end, I didn't have to use the plaster ones. I realized I could just shave a little bit off of the plastic ones and use those to begin with. The first round of molds with the plaster didn't even work anyways, so I may have to try this in the future with something more durable like resin. In the process of slicing off the bottom layer of plastic, the hobby saw slipped a few times, which stung a little bit. But that's okay, because now I feel like I have more of a personal investment in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Some might even say I have some skin in the game. I painted up the fallen soldiers and their horses, and I gave them the same dusting as the rest of the soldiers. I then snapped them off of their painting bases, and it was time to glue them in place. Luckily, the few plastic bodies that I had were enough to fill the open spaces on the base, so I didn't have to use any plaster ones. I guess we'll find out if those molds are any good next time. The last thing to do was to throw on some ambiguous battlefield liquids all over the base, and I helped them bleed together using some isopropyl alcohol. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. And a happy 20th anniversary to the full movie trilogy of The Lord of the Rings. I might have to go watch Return of the King to celebrate. Have a great week, everyone. I'll see you next time.